My God. Eleanor Richard's voice cracked as his knees slammed against the frozen cobblestones outside Père Lachaise cemetery. In his shaking hands, a photograph trembled the smiling face of the woman he had cast out years ago. But it wasn't just her image that stole his breath. Beside him, the little girl clutching the photo had his own unmistakable eyes. What would you do if it were you? Share your thoughts below. The December night in Paris carried a weight that Richard Caldwell could feel in his bones. The city was quieter than usual, its streets almost empty, the kind of silence that makes the sound of your own footsteps feel too loud. He adjusted the collar of his coat as he passed the looming gates of Père Lachaise cemetery, their iron bars glistening under the pale glow of street lamps. Richard had been in Paris countless times for business, but tonight was different. He wasn't here for champagne dinners or contract signings. He was restless, walking off the numbness of yet another boardroom victory that, like all the others, left him feeling hollow. Then he stopped. At first he thought it was a trick of the shadows. A pile of cardboard pressed against the cemetery wall, something shifting slightly in the wind. But the movement wasn't the wind. It was too intentional, too alive. Richard's eyes adjusted, and he saw her, a girl, no more than 7, curled into herself, shivering. Her small body seemed swallowed by the dark, her head resting on a thin arm, her knees pulled up to her chest. She was trying to disappear into the night, but her fragility made her impossible to ignore. For a man who prided himself on his composure, Richard felt his pulse spike. He had spent a lifetime in the company of men who moved markets, people who played with billions as though it were pocket change. Yet here, in front of the gates of the dead, a child with nothing was more arresting than any deal he had ever signed. He cleared his throat softly, not wanting to scare her. "Hey," he said, his voice lower, steadier than he felt. "Are you all right?" The girl's eyes snapped open. They were wide alert, filled with the kind of fear that comes from being alone too long. She didn't answer, but her arms tightened around something she was clutching to her chest. Richard took a step closer, careful not to startle her. The soles of his polished shoes scraped against the stone, sounding harsh against the fragile quiet. "It's okay." He tried again, his voice gentler. "I'm not here to hurt you." For a long, suspended moment she didn't move. Then, with a hesitance that made his chest ache, the girl slowly lifted her arms. She held out the object, a plastic sleeve worn thin at the corners from being held too often. Inside was a photograph. Richard reached for it carefully as if it might break in his hands. The streetlight above illuminated the image just enough for him to see. His breath caught. His knees buckled, and before he realized it, he was on the cold stone pavement. The woman in the photograph was Elena. Richard's mind struggled to process what his eyes already knew. Elena, her honey-brown hair, her unmistakable smile, the warmth in her green eyes that once belonged to him. 8 years had passed since he had last seen that face. 8 years since he had chosen ambition over love, power over the woman who had asked him only for his time. He had buried her memory under contracts and headlines, convincing himself he had moved on. But here she was, staring back at him from a photograph held in the hands of a child sleeping at a cemetery gate. Richard's throat tightened painfully. His body felt suddenly too heavy, his vision unsteady. The ground beneath him was unyielding, but it was nothing compared to the blow in his chest. He wanted to deny it, to believe this was some cruel mistake, but when he looked up again he found the girl watching him intently. And then he saw it. Her face was dirt-streaked, her hair tangled, but the eyes, the shape of them, the depth of them were undeniable. They were his eyes. The same gray-blue that looked back at him from mirrors every morning, the same eyes that marked generations of Caldwells. He had never known a moment like this, where past and present collided so violently that his future shifted in an instant. A girl, a photograph, and suddenly everything he thought he understood about his life unraveled. Richard forced himself to steady his breathing. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice trembling despite every effort to control it. The girl hesitated as though testing whether he could be trusted. Finally, she whispered Isabella. The sound of it broke him. Elena had once said if they ever had a daughter she wanted to name her Isabella. He remembered the night clearly, sitting on the balcony of their apartment in New York, wine glasses between them, Elena laughing softly as she confessed her dream of a little girl, with her hair and his stubborn eyes. He had brushed it off at the time, too, consumed with quarterly reports and the next deal on the horizon. But Elena had remembered, and here, 8 years later, the name had found its way into the world without him. Richard pressed the photograph against his chest for a moment as though anchoring himself to it. The icy air bit into his skin, but he hardly felt it. His thoughts spun. Where was Elena now? Why was Isabella alone in the streets of Paris, sleeping against a cemetery gate with nothing but a fading photo for comfort? He looked back at the girl. She was watching him, her gaze steady, despite her small frame shivering in the cold. It was not the look of a helpless child. It was the look of someone who had already survived too much. Richard felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. A man who had spent decades making decisions with ruthless precision now found himself unable to think in straight lines. There were no numbers, no strategies, no projections that could guide him through this. Only a trembling truth: this child might be his daughter. "Isabella," he whispered the name, catching in his throat. "Where is your mother?" The girl clutched her knees tighter, her voice small but clear. "She went to get medicine," she said. "She told me to wait, but she didn't come back." The words pierced him colder than the wind cutting through his coat. Richard felt the world closing in. He wanted to demand answers, but the haunted look in Isabella's eyes silenced him. He realized with sudden clarity that he had no right to press her, not when he had abandoned Elena all those years ago. Instead, he took off his coat and wrapped it around her small shoulders. The fabric swallowed her, but she didn't resist. For the first time, she leaned slightly toward him, and that small act of trust felt heavier than any business empire he had ever built. Richard stared again at the photograph in his hand, then at the child beside him. In the quiet of that Paris night at the gates of Père Lachaise, where the dead slept, he felt something in himself awaken. He had come to this city as a man of wealth and power. But tonight he had found something he never expected: the chance at a family he never knew he had already lost. Richard carried Isabella through the quiet Paris streets with a kind of urgency he had not felt in years. The weight of her small body pressed against his chest, far lighter than the burdens now flooding his mind. He hailed a car outside the cemetery gates, his voice sharper than intended, as he gave the driver the name of his hotel. Once inside, he set her down carefully on the plush armchair in the suite. A room that had always seemed spacious, but now felt foreign and unfit for the presence of a child. The marble floors gleamed, the view of the Seine glittered beyond the windows, yet none of it mattered. He realized he had built a life designed for show, not for living. Isabella looked around with wide eyes, silent but observant. She clutched the sleeve of his coat around her shoulders as if afraid it would be taken away. Richard rummaged through the minibar, discarding champagne and glass bottles, until he found a sealed bottle of water and a packet of crackers. It was pitiful, but it was all he had to offer. He crouched beside her, opening the crackers and holding them out. She accepted them with quiet gratitude, nibbling carefully as though rationing each bite. He studied her, the way her small hands held the food, the caution in her gaze, even when she was safe. This child had learned to survive in ways no 7-year-old should have to. The thought made his throat tighten. "Do you know where your mother is now?" he asked gently. Isabella shook her head, crumbs falling from her lips as she whispered, "She told me she would come back." She didn't. The matter-of-fact tone without tears was more devastating than any sob. Richard wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, but the words caught in his throat. He had spent his entire life making promises in boardrooms and negotiations, confident that he could bend reality to his will. Yet here, in front of a little girl with Elena's features and his own eyes, he could not find a single promise that felt true. After she finished eating, she leaned back, exhaustion overtaking her small frame. Within minutes, she drifted into sleep, still holding the photograph to her chest. Richard watched her torn between awe and guilt. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand shaking as if he were holding whiskey. He stood at the window overlooking Paris, but all he saw was New York. 8 years earlier, the night everything had changed. Elena had stood in their apartment doorway, her eyes brimming with tears, her voice trembling as she asked him why he never came home anymore. She had begged for just one evening together one night where the world didn't matter. He had brushed her off with the arrogance of a man who thought love could wait while ambition could not. The argument that followed had been brutal words flung like weapons. He had accused her of not understanding his vision. She had accused him of forgetting what mattered. And then, with a cruelty he still couldn't believe had come from his lips, he had told her to leave if she couldn't keep up with his life. The next morning she was gone. He told himself it was her choice that she had walked away, that he had simply given her what she wanted. But standing now with her daughter sleeping in his suite, Richard felt the full weight of what he had done. He hadn't just lost Elena. He had pushed away a woman who might have been carrying their child. He turned back to Isabella, curled in the armchair, her face soft in sleep. She had Elena's jawline, but when her head tilted, the resemblance to him was unmistakable. There was no denying it now. Isabella was his daughter. A daughter he had not known, a daughter who had lived nights on the street while he sat in penthouses surrounded by wealth he no longer cared for. Richard lowered himself into the chair opposite her, his elbows resting on his knees. The memory of his father crept unbidden into his mind, a man who had prized appearances over affection, who had taught him that success mattered more than softness. Richard had sworn as a young man that he would never become his father, and yet he had followed the same path, closing his heart, convincing himself that building an empire justified every sacrifice. Now that empire felt hollow. Looking at Isabella, he realized what he had sacrificed wasn't just Elena. It was the life they might have shared, the family they might have built. He pressed a hand against his face, a rare crack in the armor of the Millionaire CEO. For the first time in years, he felt small, human, undone. He had the power to summon entire teams with a single phone call, yet he was paralyzed in the presence of one sleeping child. A soft sound pulled him from his thoughts. Isabella stirred, murmuring something incoherent. He leaned forward, listening. She whispered one word, barely audible. "Mommy." Her lips trembled, her small hand tightening around the photo, even in sleep. Richard felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected. Whatever mistakes he had made, whatever failures haunted him, one thing was clear. He could not allow this child to be alone again. The guilt of the past was heavy, but it carried with it a strange clarity. This was his second chance, one life offering him the opportunity to undo another. He reached for a blanket from the bed and carefully draped it over her. She shifted slightly but did not wake. He lingered for a moment, watching her breathe. She was fragile, yes, but there was also strength in her. a quiet resilience that had kept her alive long enough for him to find her. Richard moved back to the window, but this time the city lights looked different. They were not the glittering symbols of success he once worshipped. They were a reminder that time kept moving, that chances slipped away if you let them. He thought of Elena again, where she might be if she was safe, if she was even alive. His heart ached at the uncertainty, but more than that, it ached with determination. He knew what his board would say if they saw him now. They would wonder why the famously unshakable Richard Caldwell had skipped meetings, why his phone calls had gone unanswered. They would tell him this was a distraction, that his empire required his focus. But for the first time, he didn't care. The empire had cost him Elena. He would not let it cost him Isabella. Richard turned back toward the sleeping girl, his expression firming into resolve. The burden of the past was heavy, but it no longer paralyzed him. It propelled him. He could not change what he had done 8 years ago, but he could change what happened next, and it would begin with her. Richard woke the next morning with the unusual sensation of being watched. He opened his eyes to find Isabella standing a few feet away barefoot on the thick hotel carpet, holding the photograph as though it were an anchor. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks still streaked with dirt. Yet there was something quietly dignified in the way she looked at him. For a moment he thought she might be frightened, but her voice was steady when she asked, "Will you be here when I wake up again?" The question pierced deeper than any accusation could. It was not asked in anger, but in fear, the kind of fear only a child abandoned too many times would carry. Richard swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Yes, I'll be here." He didn't know yet what that promise meant, but he knew it was one he would not break. The following days blurred into a rhythm unlike any Richard had ever known. He abandoned the cold luxury of his hotel suite and rented a modest apartment near the Jardin du Luxembourg. The space was nothing compared to the penthouses he was accustomed to, but its smaller rooms felt less overwhelming for Isabella. He wanted her to feel safe, not like a visitor in a stranger's palace. Each morning began the same way. Richard, who had not cooked for himself in years, fumbled in the small kitchen with eggs and toast, sometimes burning one or dropping the other. Isabella would sit at the table watching with a mixture of amusement and patience. When he finally set the plate before her, she would always say, "Thank you," with a seriousness beyond her age, as though a simple breakfast was a gift. Watching her eat carefully at first, then with growing trust that the food would not vanish, stirred something deep inside him. Afternoons became theirs to explore. Richard took her to the park at Luxembourg Gardens, where the old chestnut trees cast long shadows over the gravel paths. At first, Isabella stood back from the other children, wary, clutching his hand too tightly. But when he encouraged her to try the swing, she climbed onto the seat with cautious excitement. He pushed gently at first, then a little higher, until her laughter spilled out bright, ringing, utterly unguarded. It was a sound he had never thought he would hear, and it undid him. He laughed, too. Not the polite chuckle of boardrooms, but something full and raw, a sound that startled even him. In the evenings, when the city lights began to glow, they would sit together at the small wooden table in the apartment. Richard discovered she loved to draw, spreading out paper and colored pencils with an intensity that reminded him of his own work habits. She drew houses with windows overflowing with flowers, children holding hands, and sometimes, without seeming to realize it, she drew him. A tall figure with dark hair always standing beside her. One night, she pushed a page toward him proudly. "This is us," she said. The figure wore a suit slightly crooked in her drawing, but unmistakably him. Richard felt a lump in his throat as he studied the picture. For years, he had been portrayed in magazines and newspapers as a titan of industry. Now, for the first time, he saw himself through a child's eyes. Not a CEO, not a millionaire, just a man standing beside her. There were moments, too, when the weight of her past showed itself. At night, Isabella sometimes whimpered in her sleep, clutching the photo of Elena as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered. Richard would sit by her bed, unsure at first what to do. Comforting someone was not in his nature. He had been raised in a house where vulnerability was dismissed, but instinct guided him. He would lay a hand lightly on her shoulder, whispering that she was safe, that he was there. Slowly, the tension would ease from her small body, and she would breathe evenly again. Each time it happened, Richard felt another lock within himself click open. One rainy afternoon, as they waited out a storm, Isabella spotted the piano in the corner of the apartment lobby. Her eyes lit with a curiosity he hadn't seen before. "Can I?" she asked. He nodded, and she climbed onto the bench, her feet dangling above the floor. Her fingers touched the keys hesitantly at first, then with surprising confidence. She began to play a melody, simple, halting, but familiar. Richard froze. It was a tune Elena used to hum while cooking a tune that once filled their old apartment in New York with warmth. Hearing it now from Isabella's small hands brought tears to his eyes before he could stop them. "You know this song?" he asked, his voice rough. Isabella looked up, puzzled by his reaction. "Mommy taught me," she said simply. The words cut deep. Elena had carried the memory of their life together into the future, passing it on to the daughter he had never known. Richard sank onto the bench beside her, his hands trembling. He placed them on the keys, fumbling through the notes alongside her. Together, the music filled the empty lobby, a bridge between past regret and present hope. Day by day, something inside Richard shifted. The man who had built walls around himself, who had measured his worth in numbers and headlines, began to dissolve. In their place, a father emerged, uncertain, imperfect, but willing. He found joy not in contracts or deals, but in the way Isabella's eyes lit up when he surprised her with a new set of crayons, or the way she ran ahead of him at the park, glancing back to make sure he was still there. One evening, as the rain tapped softly against the windows, Isabella curled up on the couch beside him with a storybook. She leaned against his arm, small and warm, and without looking up from the pages, she whispered, "I like living here with you." Richard felt his chest tighten, his breath catching. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had once thrown away. For the first time in years, he believed he might deserve another chance, not as a CEO, not as a man defined by ambition, but as a father. He looked at her. Her face relaxed in the glow of the lamp, and realized that she had saved him as much as he had rescued her. The awakening of his heart was not loud or sudden. It was quiet, unfolding in drawings and laughter on the swings and the halting notes of a piano. It was the discovery that love once lost could be found again in the most unexpected of places, in the trust of a child who had chosen to believe in him. Richard had lived his entire life believing there was no problem money could not solve. But finding Elena was different. This wasn't about capital or influence. It was about uncovering the truth buried in years of absence. He began with the only path he knew: action. He contacted a discreet investigator in Paris, a man whose reputation for uncovering secrets was whispered about in corporate circles. When they met in a quiet cafe near Saint-Germain, Richard slid a photograph across the table. It was the one Isabella carried, the image of Elena, frozen in time, her smile alive with warmth. "Her name is Elena," Richard said. His voice was firm, though the hand that rested on the cup trembled slightly. "She was here. I need to know where she went." The investigator nodded, pocketing the photo, and asked for details. Richard provided what little he knew: that Elena had been in Paris, that she had disappeared while searching for medicine, that Isabella had been left behind. It was barely enough, But Richard's eyes carried the urgency of a man who would accept nothing less than results. The first leads came within days. Elena had been seen in Montmartre working at a small bookshop for a few weeks. She had rented a tiny room in a modest boarding house nearby. Neighbors described her as kind but distant, always cautious, often seen with her little girl. And then one night she vanished. The landlady recalled Elena saying she would return shortly, but she never did. It was Isabella who was left behind, eventually placed in a shelter by a concerned stranger. Richard listened to these accounts with a weight pressing down on his chest. He imagined Elena, fragile yet determined, clinging to survival while raising their daughter alone. He pictured her walking the narrow streets, clutching Isabella's hand, carrying burdens he had once promised to share. Each story added to the storm inside him, regret, guilt, and a growing fear of what might have happened when she failed to return. The investigation expanded to hospitals, shelters, police reports. Many doors closed in silence, but one thread remained: a woman admitted months ago to a public hospital after a hit-and-run accident. No identification, no family to claim her. She was recovering physically, but had lost her memory. The description, her age, her features, was close enough to ignite a desperate hope. Richard insisted on visiting immediately. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and faint despair. Richard's polished shoes clicked against the linoleum as he followed the doctor down the corridor. His pulse hammered against his ribs with every step. The doctor spoke quietly, explaining that the woman remembered fragments, dreams of a child's face, flashes of names, moments that slipped away as quickly as they surfaced. "She may not know you," the doctor warned gently. "Amnesia works in unpredictable ways." Richard nodded, though his throat was tight. He wasn't here for certainty. He was here for possibility. When they reached the room, the door stood slightly ajar. He paused at the threshold, afraid to cross into a moment that could shatter or save him. Inside, a woman sat by the window, her frame thinner than he remembered, her hair shorter, her posture weary. But when she turned, when her hazel eyes lifted to meet his, the air left his lungs. It was Elena. Time had marked her. Hardship had altered her, but it was her. She looked at him without recognition, confusion etched across her features. Yet something flickered, an unspoken recognition, a pull she couldn't name. Richard stepped forward, every controlled breath a battle against the flood of emotion rising in him. "Elena," he said softly. The name fell from his lips like a prayer. She flinched, her hand rising to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes, though she didn't understand why. "You know me." Her voice was shaky, fragile. Richard's eyes blurred, but he forced himself to speak. "Yes, I know you. I've been looking for you." He drew the photograph from his jacket, the same one Isabella carried, and held it out. Her fingers trembled as she took it. She stared at the image for a long time, then back at him, her breaths shallow. "That's me," she whispered, almost disbelieving. "And you." A tear slipped down her cheek. Fragments of memory rippled through her, flashes of laughter, of arguments, of nights under a silver dress. She clutched the photograph tighter, as if anchoring herself to it. Richard lowered himself onto the chair beside her bed. His hand shook as he reached for hers, but stopped short, afraid of overwhelming her. "There's more," he said, his voice rough. He pulled out his phone, swiping to a picture he had taken only days ago. Isabella at the park, her hair flying as she laughed on the swing. He held it out for Elena to see. The reaction was immediate. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her chest as a sob tore through her. "Her," she choked. The girl from my dreams." Her voice broke, and she pressed the photo to her lips. "My daughter." Richard could no longer hold back. "Our daughter." He said the words trembling but firm. "Elena, she's safe. She's with me." Tears streamed freely down her face, confusion mixing with relief, pain with hope. She reached out, then her fingers brushing his wrist lightly, as though needing to feel something real. "Bring her?" she whispered, her voice fierce despite the fragility. "Please, bring her to me." Richard nodded, his heart breaking and mending all at once. After years of silence, after choices that had driven them apart, after nights when he believed he would never see her again, he had found her. She might not remember every detail of their past, but she remembered the most important part, the love that bound her to their daughter. And for Richard, that was enough to begin again. Spring arrived in New York with a clarity Richard had not felt in years. The air carried the faint scent of blooming cherry trees in Central Park, and the city that once seemed like a machine of relentless ambition now felt softer, almost welcoming. Richard stood at the window of his brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, looking out at the skyline. For decades, that skyline had been nothing more than a ladder, each tower a rung to climb. But now, standing with Isabella's laughter echoing in the rooms behind him, and Elena moving slowly through the home, as she recovered her strength, the view meant something else entirely. It was not a measure of conquest, but a backdrop for the life he was finally learning to live. Elena's recovery was steady, though not without struggle. She still lost fragments of memory, still woke in the night with shadows in her eyes. But with each passing week, her spirit grew stronger. She found comfort in the simple routines they created, morning walks along the promenade afternoons, where she read to Isabella from books Richard had never bothered to open, evenings when the three of them would sit together at the dinner table. Richard, who once ate alone in silence, found himself listening to Isabella chatter about her drawings or her puzzles, while Elena smiled with quiet pride. One Sunday, Richard decided it was time for something more. He took them both to the Statue of Liberty, a place he had visited countless times with clients, but never with family. As the ferry cut through the harbor, Isabella pressed her face to the glass, her small hands fogging the window. Elena stood beside her, her hand resting gently on her daughter's shoulder. Richard watched them, his chest tightening with the realization of how fragile this moment was, and how fiercely he wanted to protect it. When they stepped onto the island and stood beneath the towering figure, Isabella looked up at him. "She looks strong," she said. Richard crouched beside her, following her gaze. "She is strong," he replied, "just like your mother. Just like you." Elena glanced at him, then her eyes glistening with a gratitude that needed no words. Back home, their brownstone quickly transformed into something Richard had never known a true home. Isabella's drawings filled the refrigerator doors, their vibrant colors spilling across the once pristine kitchen. A pair of her sneakers rested by the door next to his polished shoes, an image that never failed to soften him. He converted his study, once lined with legal documents and financial reports, into a playroom filled with puzzles books and a small upright piano. Isabella took to it instantly, her fingers dancing over the keys as she practiced the tune her mother had taught her years before. One evening, Richard sat beside her, fumbling through the notes as she corrected him with laughter. It was clumsy and imperfect, but it was theirs. Elena often watched them with a mixture of joy and sorrow. She confessed one night while they stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights that she feared she had lost too much time, that the years apart had left scars too deep to heal. Richard turned to her, then his voice steady in a way it had never been before. "We can't change the years we lost," he said, "but we can choose what to do with the years ahead. And I choose this. I choose you. I choose Isabella. Every day." Elena's tears shimmered in the glow of the city, but she nodded her hand, slipping into his. For the first time, Richard realized that forgiveness was not about erasing the past, but about building something strong enough to carry its weight. Isabella thrived in ways that astonished him. She entered a small neighborhood school where her quick mind and resilience shone through. Teachers marveled at her aptitude for patterns and problem-solving, and Richard attended every parent meeting with a pride that startled him. He rearranged his work schedule, no longer allowing late-night meetings to steal his evenings. The boardroom still demanded his presence, but he found that the empire he had built could run without his constant hand. For the first time, he understood that power was not measured by how much he controlled, but by what he was willing to let go. One evening in early summer, they gathered in the garden behind the house. Isabella darted among the flowers, chasing fireflies with a jar in her hands. Elena sat on a blanket, her hair catching the last glow of the setting sun. Richard watched them both, the weight of years of emptiness finally lifting. Isabella returned triumphantly, with a firefly glowing in her jar, holding it up for her parents to see. "Look," she whispered with awe. "It's like a tiny star." Richard crouched beside her, his voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes the smallest lights shine the brightest," he said. That night, after Isabella had fallen asleep clutching the jar with its fading glow, Richard and Elena stood in the hallway outside her room. They looked at the closed door, at the child breathing peacefully within, and then at each other. Words were unnecessary. In Isabella's laughter and her drawings, in the simple trust of her hand in theirs, they had found not only their daughter, but a path back to each other. The brownstone grew quieter as the city beyond it roared, but inside those walls life had returned in a way Richard had never imagined possible. The empire outside would always exist, a monument to his ambition, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was the sound of Isabella's piano keys drifting through the rooms, the sight of Elena reading by the window, the knowledge that he was no longer alone. A framed photograph hung on the living room wall. Isabella's idea. On one side was the worn, weathered photo she had carried with her on the streets of Paris, the image of Elena and Richard before everything fell apart. On the other side was a new photograph taken just weeks ago in the garden. Richard with his arm around Elena. Isabella perched between them, all three of them smiling beneath the sun. When visitors asked, Isabella would point to them proudly. "That one is us." When we were lost, she would say, her small finger touching the old picture. Then she would move to the new one. "And this one is us when we were found." Richard never corrected her. She was right. For all his millions, for all the towers he had climbed, the true treasure of his life was here, in the laughter, the forgiveness, and the fragile, radiant hope of a family made whole again. Richard Caldwell's story began in the icy silence of a Paris night, where a powerful man stumbled upon a fragile child sleeping against the gates of a cemetery. That single moment shattered the walls he had built around his heart and forced him to confront the mistakes that had defined his past. In Isabella's trembling hands was not only a photograph of Elena, the woman he once loved, but also the truth he could no longer ignore: he was a father. What followed was not just a journey to find Elena, but a transformation of Richard himself. From a man consumed by ambition and wealth, he became a man who rediscovered love, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. When Elena was finally found broken but alive, their reunion did not erase the years of pain, but it gave them something greater, a second chance. In New York, with Isabella's laughter filling the rooms of their home and Elena's quiet strength by his side, Richard learned that life's greatest treasures are not built in boardrooms or measured in bank accounts, but in the bonds we choose to nurture and protect. The lesson here is profound. No amount of success can heal the emptiness left by broken relationships or missed chances. But it is never too late to change. Like Richard, we can choose to show up, to forgive, and to begin again. No matter how far we've strayed, love has the power to bring us home. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support inspires us to create more stories filled with hope, love, and the kind of lessons that remind us what truly matters in life. Together, let's keep these stories alive.